Welcome to the final part 4 of the Chapter 36 Flipped Classroom. This chapter is Nationalism and Political Identities in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. We're going to be discussing Latin America, and this is the last of a monster of a chapter. Last section of a monster of a chapter, I should say. So in this section, we're going to explore Latin America faced with new imperialist threat after being independent for a century, and that new imperialist threat is the United States, which is why we say Latin America and neocolonialism. Now, while Africans had struggled against old forms of colonialism, Latin America found itself faced with a new type of imperialist threat after the First World War. Neocolonialism, as it came to be known, was more subtle than 19th century imperialism. Foreign investors, and increasingly the United States government, used economic policy rather than direct military intervention to influence or control the states of Latin America. So this is why we call this dollar diplomacy. The United States emerged from the First World War as the world's leading economic power, or really nearly so, and it almost immediately sought to use that power to secure its spheres of influence in Latin America. By replacing the European investments with American investments, the United States government hoped to realize the aim proclaimed in the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary of securing sole influence in Latin America. So remember the Monroe, we're protecting our interests, and the Roosevelt Corollary. Known in the United States under such positive slogans as dollar diplomacy and the good neighbor policy, like State Farm, right? The United States intervention in the economic affairs of South and Central states was perceived as Yankee imperialism in Latin America. You might remember this cartoon with the big stick diplomacy, the new diplomacy. So you can see America kind of separating the Europeans from the Latin Americans and Mr. Roosevelt in the center. So there was a little bit of military intervention, and the United States would talk about how this was just America trying to protect its interests. Americans controlled money, infrastructure, and they used Latin America for low skill labor. There was really no investment in their infrastructure. For example, Machu Picchu is still the railroad that goes to Machu Picchu, excuse me, is still British owned. And the Dole Fruit Company invested lots of money in transporting their fruit from place to place, but no investment in the countries where they worked as a whole. The impetus of the Great War and the Russian Revolution led Latin Americans to try out new ideas and new methods of resistance and rebellion. Though it never came to dominate any Latin American state in the interwar period, many Latin American intellectuals and university students in particular embraced the ideology of communism as a form of resistance. Oops, that should say elites. In Peru, for example, Jose Carlos Maritigüe and the Alianza Popular Revolucionaria America, APRA, or American Popular Revolutionary Alliance, and I really apologize for my pronunciation there. used communism to criticize the government. And in Mexico, artist Diego Rivera among others, combined communism with indigenous Mexican art and pre-Columbian folk traditions in murals that were as much social and political criticism as they were art. And this was commissioned by John D. Rockefeller. Diego Rivera, by the way, was the love of Frida Kahlo, who also, they were friends with Trotsky in a kind of complicated friendship. We'll leave it at that. This mural is in Detroit, and it was done for the Ford industry. Oh, I'm sorry, Man as the Center of the Universe is done by for Rockefeller. And you can see in this painting that the workers are glorified. So there's a lot of different themes going on here, from the fists coming out with the mineral wealth, like the miners. You've also got that symbolized here. And then here we have the factory, and the workers below and the bottom, you can see, are just struggling, working really, really hard to create whatever is created in this factory. So it's a celebration of the worker. Now you can see in this map, the areas of U.S. intervention are all in kind of this pink salmon color. Clearly, the United States was interested in intervening in these areas. You can't look at this map and say, oh, the United States left Latin America alone. It is very clear that we were involved heavily in different situations. And we're going to talk about a little bit more about those now. Okay, so by and large, these protests by these people who promoted communism failed to deter American enterprise. The Great Depression, however, was somewhat more successful. With the stock market in ruins, American investors could not sustain their capital investments in the Americas. And this in turn led to rapid deterioration of economic conditions in the states of South and Central America that had relied on exports of raw materials and foodstuffs. So they were hit really hard by the Great Depression. Fearful that this would lead to instability in the region, the United States turned from indirect investment to direct subsidization of what was perceived as stable regimes in Latin America during the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So we prop up regimes. However, this did allow Latin America the opportunity to industrialize when they were out from under the thumb of the United States. In several states, getting to the lower bullet, the United States financed and trained police and National Guard forces that supported the American-friendly economic and military elites. Sometimes this was very good, and sometimes this was very bad. A bad example of this is in Nicaragua, where these forces were entrusted to Anastasio Somoza Garcia, who lived until 1956. And this followed the elections of 1932. That's when he came into power. So within 4 years, Somoza had murdered the leader of the liberal opposition and maneuvered his way past President Juan Bautista Seneca to power. Now, the reason that we supported this man was because the officer Cesar Sandino was fighting a war against us, against our imperialism, against our interests in that area, our business interests in the areas. And he was actually supported by the population, not Somoza Garcia. Garcia was a incredibly harsh dictator. He was a dictator for and started a dynasty for almost 3 generations, and these his dynasty was incredibly cruel, unjust, undemocratic. But we supported him because he supported our interests. And so getting back to Sandino, Sandino, who was fighting a war against American hegemony, was told that there was going to be a peace settlement, and he, the popular representative of the people, was murdered by Garcia, who then was able to seize control. U.S. influence, however, was not always so negative. However, the good neighbor policy led to a peaceful resolution of the national crisis in Mexico. Um, so in Mexico, there was a struggle against racism against people with Indian heritage, as we've already talked about with Zapata and Pancho Villa. And the economy was very negative towards these groups. And they wanted to redistribute land, Zapata and Pancho Villa, and they wanted to have more inclusion of labor. And they actually wanted to nationalize the oil industry. So in 1938, Mexico nationalized its oil industry, which was owned by Americans. And that could have started a war, but instead, the United States used diplomacy to create an agreement with the Mexicans for payment for that industry. The American toleration for challenges from Latin America, however, was still limited. Hopefully you have a good overview of the Latin American crises now. I know this was a long flipped classroom, but it will be greatly beneficial to you when we get time to test. Have a great day.